There are places on this planet that you cannot visit, not because they are difficult to reach or require special permits, not because the weather is bad or the trail is closed for the season, but because governments, nature, history, and in some cases, the people who live there have made their position completely clear. Do not come here. And if you come anyway, do not expect to leave the same way you arrived. The islands on this list are forbidden for reasons that range from deadly biology to nuclear contamination to anthrax. One of them was used to test biological weapons and was so thoroughly poisoned that it sat under government quarantine for 48 years. One of them has a snake for every square meter of ground. One of them was the site of the largest animal attack on humans ever recorded. And one of them is home to people who have been completely isolated from the rest of humanity for an estimated 60,000 years and have made it unmistakably clear that they intend to stay that way. These are not places that are dangerous because of reputation or legend. They are forbidden because of facts. Documented, measured, legally enforced facts about what happens to people who go there. These are the 10 most dangerous forbidden islands in the world. North Sentinel Island, India. There is an island in the Bay of Bengal, roughly the size of Manhattan, where a community of people has lived in complete isolation from the rest of humanity for an estimated 60,000 years. They have no knowledge of mobile phones, the internet, governments, currency, or any of the systems that define modern life. They speak a language that no linguist has ever documented. Nobody outside the island knows their name for themselves, their traditions, their beliefs, or the full size of their population, which is estimated at somewhere between 50 and 400 people. They are known to the outside world as the Sentinelese, and they do not want visitors. North Sentinel Island sits in the Andaman chain administered by India, about 50 miles west of the main Andaman Islands. The Indian government declared the island and the surrounding waters off limits in 1956, and strengthened those protections significantly over the following decades. Today, approaching within 5 nautical miles of the island is illegal under Indian law. The law exists not as a restriction on freedom, but as a recognition of 2 simultaneous and equally serious dangers. The Sentinelese will kill outsiders who attempt contact, and outsiders can kill the Sentinelese simply by arriving. The Sentinelese have had no exposure to the common diseases that the rest of the world developed immunity to over centuries. A simple cold virus carried by an outsider onto the island could trigger an epidemic with no natural resistance to stop it. The entire population could be wiped out by something a visitor carries without knowing it. This is not speculation. It is what happened to isolated indigenous populations around the world repeatedly during the age of European exploration. The island's response to outsiders has been documented clearly. Helicopter flyovers following the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, which was suspected to have affected the island, were met with arrows fired at the aircraft. Fishermen who have drifted too close have been attacked. In November 2018, an American missionary named John Allen Chow paid local fishermen to take him as close to the island as possible, insisted on going ashore despite warnings, and was killed by the Sentinelese on the beach. His body was never recovered. In 2025, another individual illegally accessed the island and was arrested upon return. The Indian government has chosen not to prosecute the Sentinelese for the killing. The legal framework recognizes that the Sentinelese are operating within their own sovereign territory by any reasonable measure, protecting themselves from intrusion. The law that forbids approaching the island is not designed to protect outsiders from the Sentinelese. It is designed in large part to protect the Sentinelese from outsiders. North Sentinel Island may be the only place on Earth where the greatest danger is not to the visitor. It is to the people who are already there. Ilha da Queimada Grande, Brazil. About 90 miles off the coast of São Paulo, Brazil, there is a small island of roughly 43 hectares. From a distance, it looks like most tropical islands. Green, dense, peaceful. There is estimated to be 1 golden lancehead pit viper for every square meter of that island. The species is found nowhere else on Earth. Ilha da Queimada Grande, known universally as Snake Island, became what it is through a geological accident. When sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age approximately 11,000 years ago, a section of Brazilian coastal land was cut off from the mainland. The species of pit viper that was on that land when it separated became isolated. With no land mammals to hunt, the snakes evolved over millennia to prey on migratory birds that land on the island to rest. To bring down a bird quickly enough before it could fly away, the venom evolved to be significantly more potent and faster acting than that of the mainland relatives of the same species. The golden lancehead carries venom estimated to be 3 to 5 times more potent than that of the mainland lanceheads, It causes tissue death at the site of the bite, internal bleeding, kidney failure, and brain hemorrhage. Without treatment, a bite is likely to be fatal. Treatment requires antivenom that is not available on a remote island. The closest hospital is hours away by boat. The Brazilian government has made it illegal to visit Snake Island except for approved scientific researchers and members of the Brazilian Navy who maintain the lighthouse on the island's peak. The last known permanent residents of the island were a lighthouse keeper and his family in the early 20th century, who, according to local legend, died when snakes entered the lighthouse through the windows. Scientists who have visited the island under permit describe a landscape where snakes are visible at almost every step. They are on the ground, in the trees, on rocks, and climbing the walls of the lighthouse itself. There is no part of the island where a visitor is not, at all times, extremely close to an animal capable of killing them before they could reach any form of medical care. The population of golden lanceheads is currently estimated at between 2,000 and 4,000 individuals. The Brazilian government's restriction on visitors also serves to protect the snake, which is listed as critically endangered. The island is the entire range of the species. If something happens to the island's ecosystem, the golden lancehead ceases to exist. Gruinard Island, Scotland. Gruinard Island is a small, oval-shaped piece of land in Gruinard Bay on the west coast of Scotland. It is roughly 1.2 miles long and 0.6 miles wide. It has green hills, wild grass, and views across the Scottish Highlands that would, under any other circumstances, make it a quietly beautiful destination. In 1942, the British government bought the island for £500 and turned it into a biological weapons testing site. As part of an operation called Operation Vegetarian, scientists from the Portondown Research Facility traveled to Gruinard to test the effectiveness of anthrax as a weapon. They brought 80 sheep to the island, tethered them in positions around a central area, and detonated bombs packed with anthrax spores. The spores dispersed on the wind. The sheep began dying within 3 days, blood oozing from their bodies as the infection destroyed them from the inside. The tests confirmed that anthrax worked as a weapon. Scientists concluded that a large release of spores over a German city would render it uninhabitable for decades. The plan, which involved dropping feed cakes laced with anthrax over German farmland to contaminate the food supply, was prepared but never used as the war turned in the Allies' favor. When the scientists left Gruinard, they left something behind that they could not remove. Anthrax spores are extraordinarily durable. Unlike the bacteria themselves, the spores can survive in soil for decades or longer. The burning and treatment attempts made during and after the war did not remove them. The island was placed under indefinite quarantine. Warning signs were installed around its beaches. For 48 years, no one was permitted to land on Gruinard Island. In 1981, a shadowy group calling itself the Dark Harvest Commandos began a pressure campaign against the government. They collected soil from Gruinard, confirmed it still contained anthrax, and left samples at Portondown and at a Conservative Party conference in Blackpool as a warning. The action forced the issue into public awareness and eventually drove the government to begin a serious decontamination effort in 1986. 280 tons of formaldehyde solution diluted in seawater were sprayed over every hectare of the island. The most contaminated topsoil was removed and disposed of. Sheep were reintroduced and remained healthy. In 1990, the government declared Gruinard safe and removed the warning signs. The original owner's heirs repurchased it for the original 1942 price of £500. The island is technically accessible today, but the question of whether anthrax spores survive deep in soil that was never fully treated in an island that spent 48 years as a government-designated biohazard zone is a question that scientists continue to debate. Ramree Island, Myanmar. Ramree Island sits off the coast of Rakhine State in Myanmar, separated from the mainland by a narrow strait roughly 150 meters wide. It is a large island by the standards of this list, covering approximately 1,350 square kilometers. Most of it is covered in mangrove swamp. In January and February of 1945, Ramree Island became the site of what the Guinness Book of World Records has described as the greatest disaster suffered by humans due to animals in recorded history. During World War II, British forces under General Sir William Slim launched Operation Matador, an amphibious assault on Ramree Island to capture a strategic airbase. The approximately 1,000 Japanese soldiers defending the island were surrounded and cut off. Refusing to surrender, they attempted to retreat through the mangrove swamps to reach the Japanese mainland forces on the other side. The swamps were home to large populations of saltwater crocodiles, the largest reptile species on Earth. Saltwater crocodiles can reach lengths of more than 20 feet and weights exceeding 1 ton. They are apex predators in their habitat and actively hunt prey significantly larger than themselves. The mangrove swamp at night, in water surrounded by 1,000 armed but desperate and exhausted men, was a feeding opportunity unlike anything the crocodiles would normally encounter. British forces positioned outside the swamp heard sounds throughout the night that accounts describe as screams, gunshots, and the thrashing of large animals. By morning, of the approximately 1,000 Japanese soldiers who had entered the swamp, fewer than 20 were taken prisoner by the British. The fate of the others is not fully documented. Some died from other causes in the retreat, but a significant number, by the accounts of British officers present, were taken by crocodiles during the night. The Guinness World Record entry describes the incident as the largest crocodile attack on humans ever recorded. Some historians have questioned the precise numbers given the chaos of war and the difficulty of verification, but the broad outline of the event is documented in military accounts from both sides. Ramree Island today remains populated by large numbers of saltwater crocodiles. The mangrove swamps are dense, difficult to navigate, and home to insects that carry disease in addition to the crocodiles. It is not a place that draws casual visitors, and the wildlife that made one night in 1945 historically significant has not become less dangerous in the decades since. Poveglia Island, Italy. In the Venetian Lagoon, a short boat ride from one of the most visited cities in the world, there is a small island that the Italian government has kept closed to public access for decades. Poveglia is not closed because of anthrax or snakes or hostile residents. It is closed because of a history of human suffering so concentrated and so prolonged that it has left the island with a reputation that endures long after the events themselves. The island's first documented use as a place to send people away from Venice was in the 14th century, during the Black Death. As the plague spread through the city, Venetian authorities used Poveglia as a quarantine island, sending plague victims and those suspected of infection there to live, and in most cases to die, in isolation from the healthy population. Mass graves were dug on the island. Bodies were burned in large quantities. The soil of the island is estimated to contain the remains of more than 100,000 people who died there during the various plague outbreaks that continued across multiple centuries. In 1922, a psychiatric hospital was established on the island. Patients were committed to Poveglia and treated under the conditions of early institutional psychiatry, which in many cases meant conditions that would today be considered deeply inhumane. The hospital operated for 46 years before being closed in 1968. The buildings have been empty ever since, deteriorating in the salt air of the lagoon while vegetation slowly reclaims the interior. The Italian government has repeatedly attempted to sell Poveglia or find a development use for it, but the combination of legal complications, the island's history, and the practical challenges of building on land saturated with centuries of organic material have made those efforts difficult. Access is officially restricted. Ghost tourism has made it a target for unauthorized visits, each of which risks contact with structurally compromised buildings that have been deteriorating without maintenance for over 50 years. What makes Poveglia uniquely disturbing among the islands on this list is not a specific threat like venom or radiation or weaponized bacteria. It is the sheer density of human tragedy concentrated on a small piece of land over a very long time. The soil beneath Poveglia is layered with history that the island has never fully been allowed to move on from. Bikini Atoll, Marshall Islands. Bikini Atoll is a coral ring of 23 small islands in the central Pacific Ocean, roughly equidistant between Hawaii and Australia. Before 1946, it was a largely unknown and beautiful corner of the Pacific, home to a small Marshallese community of around 167 people who had lived there for generations. Then the United States decided it needed somewhere to test nuclear weapons. The 167 residents were relocated to Rongerik Atoll, a much smaller and less fertile island, and told they would be able to return once the tests were complete. Between 1946 and 1958, the United States detonated 23 nuclear devices at Bikini Atoll. The tests included Castle Bravo in 1954, the largest nuclear weapon ever detonated by the United States, with a yield of 15 megatons. Castle Bravo was significantly more powerful than predicted. The fallout spread across thousands of miles of Pacific Ocean, contaminating the crew of a Japanese fishing vessel 80 miles away, with radiation sickness so severe that one crew member died. Residents of neighboring atolls who had not been evacuated experienced radiation exposure that caused lasting health consequences for decades. The Bikini Atoll people have never been able to return permanently. Resettlement attempts in the late 1960s and 1970s ended when tests confirmed that radioactive cesium-137 remained in the soil at levels that made food grown on the island unsafe to eat. The United States eventually paid compensation to the Bikini people and their descendants. The islands remain largely uninhabited, owned by a people who cannot live there. The physical evidence of the nuclear tests remains. The lagoon contains the wrecks of ships placed there as test targets, now ghost fleet of warships sitting at the bottom of beautifully clear water in an environment made famous by the United States government for a different kind of reason than most diving destinations. Scuba divers visit under controlled conditions. Visitors are warned not to eat anything grown on the islands. The soil produces food that accumulates cesium at levels the human body was not designed to carry. Bikini Atoll is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It is also an uninhabitable island that was taken from its people, saturated with nuclear explosions over 12 years, and then offered back to those people in a condition in which they still cannot safely live. Miyakejima, Japan. Miyakejima is a volcanic island in the Izu archipelago, about 180 kilometers south of Tokyo. Around 2,800 people live on it. It has a post office, schools, a ferry connection to the mainland, and what is almost certainly the most unusual requirement for residents of any permanently inhabited island on Earth. Everyone on Miyakejima is required to carry a gas mask at all times. The island's central volcano, Mount Oyama, erupted catastrophically in 2000. The eruption released enormous quantities of sulfur dioxide gas, which is toxic to humans at elevated concentrations and causes respiratory failure at high enough levels. The entire population of roughly 3,800 residents was evacuated. They remained evacuated for 4.5 years. When residents were finally allowed to return in 2005, it was under conditions that acknowledged the ongoing reality of the island's geology. Mount Oyama continues to release sulfur dioxide gas in amounts that fluctuate unpredictably. A network of sensors monitors the gas levels across the island. When concentrations exceed safe thresholds, alarms sound, and residents are required to immediately put on their gas masks wherever they are. The residents who returned knew this was the situation. They chose to return anyway. Some had lived on the island for generations and considered it home in a way that outweighed the ongoing volcanic hazard. Others had practical ties to fishing and agriculture on the island. Their relationship with the volcano is a daily negotiation between belonging to a place and surviving the place they belong to. Foreign visitors to Miyakejima are required to carry gas masks that are provided upon arrival. This is not a precaution for extreme circumstances. It is standard practice on an island where the air can become dangerous on any given day without significant warning, because the mountain at the center of the island has not stopped doing what it did in 2000. Vozrojdeniya Island, Aral Sea. Vozrojdeniya Island sat in the Aral Sea for decades, accessible only by boat across one of the most remote bodies of water in Central Asia. The Soviet Union chose it for exactly that reason. Between the 1930s and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Vozrojdeniya Island, whose name translates to Rebirth Island, was used as a classified biological weapons testing facility. The pathogens tested there included anthrax, smallpox, plague, brucellosis, and several other agents considered for use in biological warfare. The testing involved live animals and, in documented cases, was conducted at a scale that the Soviet biological weapons program considered as preparation for large-scale deployment in wartime. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the scientists and military personnel at the facility left quickly. Some pathogen stores were buried rather than properly destroyed. Canisters, equipment, and laboratory materials were abandoned in place. The specific inventory of what was left behind and in what condition has never been fully disclosed by any of the successor states. The situation became significantly more complicated over the following decades because of an environmental disaster that had nothing to do with the biological weapons. The Aral Sea, one of the 4 largest lakes in the world in the mid-20th century, was almost completely destroyed by Soviet agricultural irrigation projects that diverted the rivers feeding it. By the early 21st century, the Aral Sea had shrunk to a fraction of its original size. Vozrojdeniya Island is no longer an island. The receding waters of the Aral Sea connected it to the surrounding land, turning it from an island into a peninsula. This means the biological contamination from the Soviet testing program Whatever is buried there and whatever remains in the soil and the ruins of the facility is now accessible on foot from the mainland of Uzbekistan. The full picture of what is in the ground at Vozrojdeniya and what the decades of burial and the changing environmental conditions have done to the buried material is not publicly known. What is known is that one of the most extensive biological weapons programs in history operated on this piece of land for 60 years, and the people who knew its full contents left in a hurry. Surtsey Island, Iceland. Off the southern coast of Iceland, there is an island that did not exist before 1963. On November 14th of that year, a volcanic eruption began from the seafloor at a depth of about 130 meters. The eruption continued for 4 years, eventually building a new island from the accumulated volcanic material. By the time the eruption ended in 1967, Surtsey, named after the Norse fire giant Surtur, was 2.7 square kilometers in size and had risen more than 150 meters above the sea. Scientists recognized immediately that Surtsey represented something extraordinary, a brand new island, completely sterile at the moment of its creation, where the process of ecological colonization could be observed from the very beginning without the complication of any prior biological history. Plants, insects, birds, marine mammals, and microorganisms would arrive and establish themselves over time, and every step of that process could be documented. To preserve the scientific integrity of what was happening, Iceland restricted access to Surtsey essentially from the beginning. Only scientists with approved research purposes are permitted on the island. Tourist access is completely prohibited. The reason is not physical danger in the traditional sense. It is biological. A visitor stepping onto Surtsey carries seeds on their clothing, microorganisms on their skin, and foreign biological material that would contaminate the very succession process the island exists to document. Even the small number of scientists who do visit are required to follow strict protocols to minimize what they bring onto the island. The prohibition on Surtsey is unique among the islands on this list because it is not primarily about protecting humans from the island. It is about protecting the island from humans, specifically from the biological material that humans carry everywhere without noticing, which on every other piece of land on Earth is simply part of the background noise of ecosystems that already exist. On Surtsey, that background noise is the experiment. The island has been a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 2008. It is also a place where the strict understanding that human presence corrupts the data has made it one of the most tightly controlled natural environments on the planet. Niihau Island, Hawaii, United States. Not every forbidden island on this list is forbidden because of weapons, venom, or volcanoes. Niihau, the westernmost inhabited island of Hawaii, is forbidden because the people who live there have chosen, and maintained for more than 160 years, to be left alone. Niihau is 18 miles southwest of Kauai and covers about 70 square miles. It was purchased in 1864 by Elizabeth Sinclair, a New Zealand-born Scottish rancher, from the Kingdom of Hawaii for $10,000. The Robinson family, descendants of Sinclair, still own it. The approximately 130 to 170 residents of Niihau are primarily native Hawaiian, and many of them speak Hawaiian as their first language in a place where the language's survival has been maintained almost entirely in isolation from the tourism, development, and cultural dilution that affected the rest of Hawaii. There are no paved roads on Niihau. There is no electricity from the main grid. There are no hotels. There is no internet access for general use. The residents live largely as they have for generations, with the specific character of Hawaiian culture that existed before the massive demographic transformation that followed statehood and mass tourism. Access is controlled by the Robinson family, who permit only the residents of the island, invited guests, government officials, and military personnel. Small helicopter tours that land on specific designated coastal areas are now permitted, but access to the main village and community areas remains restricted. What Niihau represents is a kind of island forbidden by choice rather than by law or physical danger. The people who live there have not been forced into isolation. They have maintained it, supported in large part by the Robinson family's ownership structure, as a way of preserving something that the other Hawaiian islands have largely lost. The island is sometimes called the Forbidden Island, not because anyone is in danger there, but because it stands as one of the few remaining examples of a community that has drawn a clear line between itself and the world outside, and has been allowed to keep that line intact. These 10 islands have almost nothing in common except one thing. They are places where the normal human assumption of access, the idea that if you can physically reach somewhere you can go there, has been specifically and deliberately refused. Some were made dangerous by nature. Some were made dangerous by governments that chose them for experiments they did not want the public to see. Some are protected by people who were there long before the concept of international travel existed, and who have made it clear they intend to remain undisturbed. Some protect us from themselves. Some protect themselves from us. The Forbidden Island is a specific kind of place, not just hard to reach, not just remote, specifically denied. And in every case on this list, the denial exists for reasons that are, when you look at them clearly, entirely reasonable. Which of these islands makes you most curious about what it actually looks like from the inside? Leave it in the comments. And if you want to keep exploring the places on this planet that the world has decided to keep closed, subscribe to Parallel Facts. We will keep going.